The book arrived at bookstores on a Tuesday morning in February 1983, Going My Own Way by Gary Crosby with Ross Firestone. The cover showed Gary's face, serious and defiant. The subtitle promised revelations, a personal account of life as Bing Crosby's son. Publishers Weekly had called it explosive. People magazine had already excerpted chapters, and within hours of release, the phone started ringing at Kathryn Crosby's home in Hillsborough, California. Bing Crosby had been dead for 6 years. He died on October 14, 1977, on that golf course in Spain. Died doing what he loved. Died at peace, or so everyone thought. But now his eldest son was telling a different story. A story of violence, of cruelty. Of a father who beat his children with belts, who ruled through fear, who smiled for the cameras and terrorized his family behind closed doors. And Bing wasn't here to defend himself, couldn't respond, couldn't explain, couldn't tell his side. Gary Crosby was 50 years old when the book came out. He'd been a child actor, a singer, a television star on his own show, but success had eluded him in adulthood. His acting career faded, his marriages failed. He struggled with alcohol, with weight, with the burden of being Bing Crosby's son, and now he was fighting back. Telling the truth, he called it, setting the record straight, making sure people knew what really happened in the Crosby household when the cameras stopped rolling. The book's opening chapters were devastating. Gary described his childhood in graphic detail. He wrote about Bing coming home after work, drinking, getting angry over small things, homework not done, chores incomplete, talking back, and then the belt would come off. Gary wrote about being beaten, about his brothers being beaten, about living in fear, about trying to be perfect because anything less meant pain. He wrote about Bing's coldness, his distance, the way he'd go weeks without speaking to his sons, the way affection was withheld, the way love felt conditional, earned through performance, lost through failure. Gary painted a picture of a house where children walked on eggshells, where Bing's moods dictated everything, where the man the world saw, warm and relaxed and funny, was a fiction, a performance. The real Bing, Gary claimed, was something else entirely. The media seized on it immediately. Bing Crosby, America's crooner, exposed as an abusive father. The contradiction was too good to ignore. Here was the man who sang White Christmas, the man who played priests in movies, the wholesome entertainer, and his own son was calling him a monster. Talk shows booked Gary. Newspapers ran features. The story dominated entertainment news for weeks. But there was a problem with Gary's story, a significant problem. Bing had 7 children, 4 sons from his first marriage to Dixie Lee, 3 children from his second marriage to Kathryn Grant. Gary was one of the 4 from the first marriage, and the other 3, his brothers, weren't backing him up. In fact, they were furious. Philip Crosby, Gary's twin brother, gave an interview 2 weeks after the book came out. He was direct, blunt, almost angry. Gary's book is fiction, Philip said. Dad was strict. Yes, he had high expectations. Yes, he believed in discipline. Absolutely. But abuse? No. That's Gary rewriting history to sell books. Philip's voice was tight, controlled. I was there. I lived in the same house. I had the same father. And what Gary describes didn't happen, not the way he says it did. Dennis Crosby, another brother, was less diplomatic. He called Gary a liar, said the book was a betrayal, said Gary was exploiting their father's death for money and attention. Dennis pointed out something important. Gary waited until Dad died to write this. Why? If it was so terrible, why not confront him when he was alive? Why wait until he can't respond? Lindsay Crosby, the 4th brother, was quieter but equally opposed. He told a reporter that Gary had always been troubled, always needed someone to blame, and now Dad was an easy target. Dead men can't sue for defamation. The Crosby family split became public, Gary on one side, his 3 brothers on the other, and in the middle, trying to make sense of it all, was Kathryn Crosby, Bing's widow, the stepmother Gary barely knew. Kathryn was 50 years old in 1983. She'd been married to Bing for 19 years before he died. She'd had 3 children with him, Harry, Mary Frances, and Nathaniel, and her experience of Bing as a father was completely different from what Gary described. Kathryn's Bing was gentle, patient, present. He attended school plays, helped with homework, played with the kids. He was older when he had his second family. in his 50s and 60s, and maybe age had softened him, maybe he'd learned from mistakes, or maybe Kathryn believed Gary was simply lying. She gave one interview after the book came out, just one. She sat in her living room in Hillsborough, surrounded by photographs of Bing on the golf course, Bing with the children, Bing laughing. She looked at the interviewer and spoke carefully, measured. "I won't say Gary is lying," she said. "I'll say Gary remembers things differently than they happened. Memory is selective, pain can distort, and Gary was an unhappy child who became an unhappy man. He needed someone to blame for his struggles, and Bing unfortunately became that person." The interviewer asked about the beatings, the belt, the violence Gary described. Kathryn shook her head. Bing believed in discipline. This was the 1940s, spanking was normal, expected. But what Gary describes, systematic abuse, that's not the man I knew. That's not the father our children knew. Kathryn's eyes were dry, clear. She wasn't defensive, just certain. If Bing was the monster Gary claims, I would have seen it. Our children would have seen it. But we didn't, because it wasn't there. The public didn't know what to believe. On one hand, Gary seemed credible. He was Bing's son. He'd lived there. Why would he lie about something so serious? On the other hand, 3 of his brothers said he was wrong, and Bing's second family had a completely different experience. So who was telling the truth? The answer, as it often is, was complicated. Somewhere between Gary's accusations and his brother's denials lay something closer to reality. Bing Crosby was a man of his time, born in 1903, raised in a strict Catholic household. He believed children should be obedient, respectful, hard-working, and he enforced those beliefs with discipline, sometimes physical discipline. By modern standards, that's abuse. By 1950s standards, that was parenting. But there was more to it. Bing's first marriage to Dixie Lee was troubled. Dixie was an alcoholic, struggled with depression. The household was chaotic. Bing was often gone, working, building his career, and when he was home, he was tired, stressed, not equipped emotionally to handle 4 boys, so he defaulted to what he knew: control, order, discipline. By the time he married Kathryn in 1957, Bing was different, older, wealthier, more secure. He didn't need to prove anything, didn't need to work as hard. He had time, patience, and his approach to parenting changed. He was gentler with his second set of children, more involved, more affectionate, not because he loved them more, but because he'd learned, evolved, become a different version of himself. Gary never saw that version. Gary only knew the Bing of the 1940s and early 1950s, the Bing who was building an empire, who was under pressure, who was dealing with a wife's alcoholism and his own demons. That Bing was harder, stricter, less forgiving, and Gary's memories were shaped by that reality. But memories are also shaped by other things, by resentment, by disappointment, by the gap between who you wanted your father to be and who he actually was. Gary wanted Bing to be warm, affectionate, present, and Bing wasn't those things. Not in the way Gary needed. So the disappointment festered, grew, and over decades it transformed into anger, into bitterness, and eventually into a book. The question wasn't whether Gary was lying. The question was whether Gary's truth was the only truth. And clearly it wasn't. Philip, Dennis, and Lindsay had lived in the same house, had the same father, and their experience was different. Not because Bing treated them differently, but because they processed it differently. They accepted who Bing was. They didn't expect him to be something he wasn't, and that acceptance saved them from the bitterness that consumed Gary. In the weeks after the book's release, people started coming forward with their own stories. People who'd known Bing, worked with him, spent time with him, and their accounts complicated the narrative even further. Bob Hope gave an interview defending Bing, said Bing was one of the most decent men he'd ever known. Rosemary Clooney said the same. Phil Harris, who'd worked with Bing for years, called Gary's book a hatchet job. But there were others, a few, not many, but a few, who said they'd seen Bing be cold, distant, hard on his kids. They didn't say abuse, they didn't confirm Gary's worst claims, but they said, yeah, Bing could be tough, could be strict, could be unyielding, and if you were his kid, that probably wasn't easy. The truth, messy and complicated, was that Bing Crosby was neither saint nor monster. He was a man, flawed, imperfect, shaped by his time and his circumstances. He loved his children, but he didn't always know how to show it. He wanted them to succeed, but he pushed too hard. He had standards, but those standards were sometimes unreachable, and in trying to make his sons strong, he made at least one of them broken. 3 months after the book came out, Kathryn held a press conference. She'd been advised not to, told to let it die down, but she couldn't. Bing's reputation was being destroyed, and she felt she owed it to him to fight back. She stood at a podium in Los Angeles, read a statement, then opened it up for questions. The first question was obvious. "Do you think Gary is lying?" Kathryn didn't hesitate. "I think Gary believes what he's saying, but belief doesn't make it true. Memory is unreliable, especially when filtered through pain. Gary had a difficult childhood. I don't dispute that, but to blame it all on Bing, to paint him as some kind of sadist, that's unfair. That's not the whole story." "What is the whole story?" a reporter asked. Kathryn took a breath. "The whole story is that Bing was a complicated man. He was raised in a different era. He had different ideas about parenting. Were they perfect? No. Did he make mistakes? Of course. But did he love his children? Absolutely. And that's what Gary's book misses. The love, the intention, the fact that Bing did the best he knew how." Another reporter jumped in. "But Gary says Bing beat him with a belt. Are you saying that didn't happen?" Kathryn's jaw tightened. "I'm saying discipline in the 1940s looked different than it does now. Spanking was common. Belts were used. That was normal. I'm not defending it. I'm contextualizing it. Bing wasn't uniquely cruel. He was a product of his time. So you admit he hit his children?" "Yes," Kathryn said. "He disciplined them, physically, as millions of parents did in that era. But there's a difference between discipline and abuse, and Gary is claiming abuse, systematic, sadistic abuse, and I'm telling you, that's not accurate." The press conference lasted 30 minutes. Kathryn answered every question, stayed calm, stayed composed, but when it was over, she went to her car and cried, not because she doubted herself, but because she knew it wouldn't matter. The damage was done. Bing's image was tarnished, and nothing she said would fully repair it. What Kathryn didn't reveal at that press conference, what she wouldn't reveal for years, was that she had evidence, something Gary didn't know about, something that would, if released, completely change the narrative. A letter, written by Bing, in 1974, 3 years before he died. A letter he'd written to his 4 sons from his first marriage. A letter he'd asked Kathryn to hold, not to send, just to keep, in case it was ever needed. Bing had known, even back in 1974, he'd sensed the resentment, particularly from Gary. They'd had a conversation, a difficult one. Gary had brought up the past, complained about how he was raised, accused Bing of being too hard, too distant, and Bing had listened, hadn't defended himself, hadn't argued, just listened, and after Gary left, Bing sat down and wrote a letter. The letter was 5 pages, handwritten. Bing's handwriting was neat, deliberate. He started by acknowledging his failures, admitting he hadn't been the father they needed, explaining that he'd done his best, but recognizing his best hadn't been good enough. He wrote about the pressures he was under, the career, the travel, Dixie's illness, the weight of being the primary breadwinner for a large family. He didn't use those things as excuses, just as context. Then Bing wrote something that would become the most quoted part of the letter, if it were ever released. He wrote, "I loved you boys more than I could express, but I didn't know how to show it. I was raised by a man who believed affection made children weak, and I carried that belief into my own parenting. I regret that. If I could go back and do it over, I would hold you more, tell you I was proud more often, be gentler, but I can't go back. All I can do is tell you now, I love you, I always did, and I'm sorry I didn't make that clear when it mattered most." Kathryn kept the letter in a safe. After Bing died, she considered giving it to the boys, but the timing never felt right, and after Gary's book came out, she considered releasing it publicly, showing the world that Bing had been self-aware, had recognized his mistakes, had tried in his own way to make amends, but she decided against it, because releasing the letter would feel like using Bing's words to win an argument, and that felt wrong. Instead, Kathryn called Philip, Dennis, Lindsay. She told them about the letter, read it to them over the phone. All three of them cried. Philip said, "That's Dad. That's exactly who he was. Trying. Imperfect, but trying." Dennis asked if they could have copies. Kathryn made 3 copies, sent them, and the brothers kept them private, personal, between them and their father. Gary never saw the letter. Kathryn never offered it to him, and years later, when asked why, she said simply, Gary wasn't ready to hear it. He needed his anger, needed his narrative, and showing him evidence that contradicted that narrative would have been cruel. So I let him have his truth, even though it wasn't the whole truth. The fallout from Gary's book lasted years. Bing's legacy was debated, re-examined. Some people believed Gary completely, saw Bing as a hypocrite, a man who sold warmth while practicing cruelty. Others dismissed Gary entirely, saw him as a bitter son exploiting his father's death. Most people landed somewhere in the middle, acknowledging that Bing had been flawed but rejecting the idea that he was monstrous. What got lost in all of it was nuance. The understanding that people are complex, that you can love someone and hurt them, that you can do your best and still fail, that intentions matter, but so do impacts. Bing Crosby intended to raise strong, disciplined, successful sons, and he did. 3 of them turned out fine, productive, stable, but one didn't, and that failure, that one son who couldn't reconcile his childhood, became the lens through which Bing's entire legacy was viewed. Gary Crosby died on August 24, 1995. He was 62 years old, lung cancer. He'd never reconciled with his father's memory, never softened his stance. The book remained his definitive statement, his truth, and he went to his grave believing he'd done the right thing, believing he'd told a story that needed to be told. His brothers attended the funeral. Philip, Dennis, Lindsay, they stood together at the grave, but they didn't speak about Gary's book, didn't reference it. They'd made peace with their brother years ago, accepted that he saw things differently, that his pain was real even if his conclusions weren't entirely accurate, and now he was gone, and whatever bitterness existed could be buried with him. Kathryn came to the funeral. She brought flowers, white roses. She stood at a distance, respectful. She'd never been close to Gary. He'd resented her, resented that Bing had found happiness with a second family while the first family fell apart. Gary saw Kathryn as evidence of Bing's failures. If Dad could be a good father to your kids, Gary had told her once, then he chose not to be a good father to us. That thought had poisoned any possibility of relationship. After Gary's death, something shifted in the conversation about Bing Crosby. The vitriol lessened. The debates became less heated. Distance created perspective. People started asking more nuanced questions. Not was Bing good or bad, but what did it mean to be a father in mid-century America? What were the expectations, the pressures, the cultural norms? Historians started examining the era more carefully. The 1940s and 1950s had very different ideas about parenting than the 1980s and 1990s. Fathers were expected to be providers, disciplinarians, distant authority figures. Warmth was the mother's job. Boys especially were raised to be tough, stoic, self-sufficient, and that raising often involved physical punishment, not because parents were cruel, but because that's what everyone did. Bing Crosby followed that standard. He wasn't an outlier. He was typical, average for his time. What made him different was his fame. The contrast between the warm crooner on screen and the strict father at home created cognitive dissonance. People couldn't reconcile the two, so they chose sides. But the truth, as Philip Crosby said in a 1998 interview, was simpler. Dad was just a dad, flawed like all dads. He made mistakes. Had he lived in a different era, with different ideas about parenting, he would have done things differently. But he didn't. He lived when he lived, and he parented the way he was taught to parent. Dennis Crosby never fully recovered from Gary's book. He defended their father publicly, but privately, he wondered, if Gary hurt that much, did I miss something? Dennis struggled with depression, with guilt, with the weight of being a Crosby. On May 4, 1991, Dennis committed suicide. He was 56 years old, left a note that mentioned the family, the pain, the impossibility of living up to the name. Lindsay followed. December 11, 1989, also suicide, 51 years old. 3 of Bing's 4 sons from his first marriage died by their own hand. That's not coincidence, that's pattern, that's evidence of pain, deep unresolved pain. But what caused that pain? Was it Bing? Was it fame? Was it genetics? Dixie Lee, their mother, had been an alcoholic. Depression ran in families. The boys had been raised in Hollywood, in the spotlight, expected to perform. That pressure came from everywhere, not just Bing. Bing's second family watched all of this from a distance. Harry Crosby, Mary Frances Crosby, and Nathaniel Crosby had completely different childhoods than their half-brothers, and they struggled to reconcile the father Gary described with the father they knew. Harry Crosby gave an interview in 1990. He was asked directly about Gary's book. Harry was careful but clear. "The father I knew was kind. He was present. He came to my school events. He taught me golf. We talked. Really talked. That's my experience. I can't speak to Gary's experience. But the man Gary describes isn't the man who raised me." Mary Frances echoed that. She said Bing had been wonderful, patient, supportive, proud. She acknowledged that he was older when she was born, in his 50s, and maybe that age brought wisdom, but she also believed Bing had learned from his first marriage, had seen what distance cost him, and had chosen differently the second time. Nathaniel had perhaps the closest relationship with Bing. They played golf together constantly. Nathaniel became a professional golfer, won the U.S. Amateur Championship in 1981, and Bing had been there, watching, cheering, bursting with pride. Nathaniel said his father never pressured him, never demanded perfection, just encouraged him to do what he loved. The contrast between Bing's 2 families became a point of study. Psychologists wrote about it. How parenting in your 30s is different from parenting in your 60s. How first children often bear the brunt of a parent's learning curve. Bing's first 4 sons were experiments. By the time he had his second family, he'd figured some things out. That's not fair to the first 4, but it's human. In 2001, Kathryn Crosby published her own book, a memoir, My Life with Bing. It wasn't a rebuttal to Gary's book, it was simply her story. And in it, she addressed Gary's allegations briefly. She wrote, "Gary's pain was real. I don't question that. But his interpretation of that pain was incomplete. Bing wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a monster either. He was a man trying to navigate impossible pressures." The book included the letter, the one Bing had written in 1974. Kathryn decided it was time. Bing had been dead for 24 years. Gary had been dead for 6. The letter needed to be part of the record. When the letter was published, it changed things. Not completely. Gary's defenders still defended him, said the letter was too little, too late. But others saw evidence of self-awareness, of regret, of a man who knew he'd failed and wished he could fix it. Philip read the published letter and wept, even though he'd had his own copy for years. Seeing it in print made it real in a new way. He gave an interview shortly after, said, "This is what people need to understand. Dad knew. He knew he hadn't been the father we needed. And it hurt him. He carried that, and he tried to do better." By the 2010s, the conversation about Bing Crosby had matured. People stopped arguing about whether he was good or bad, started asking better questions. What does it mean to be a good parent? How do we measure that? By intention or impact? By the standards of the time or by universal principles? In 2014, on what would have been Bing's 111th birthday, Kathryn organized a small gathering, just family, Bing's children from both marriages, Harry, Mary Frances, Nathaniel, and Philip, the last surviving son from the first marriage. They met at the house in Hillsborough. They didn't talk about the book, didn't rehash the arguments. They just shared stories. Philip told about the time Bing taught him to fish. Harry talked about golf lessons. Nathaniel talked about the quiet talks they'd had. And Mary Frances said something that stayed with everyone. We all had different fathers, because we had Dad at different times in his life. Philip had young Bing, stressed Bing, building his career Bing. We had older Bing, established Bing, settled Bing. Neither version is the whole truth. Both are real. Philip nodded. He'd spent years being angry that Bing had been different with the second family. It had felt like rejection, like proof that Bing could have been that way with Philip, but chose not to be. But Mary Frances's words reframed it. Bing hadn't chosen. He devolved. The gathering ended with Kathryn reading Bing's letter aloud. Bing's voice, through Kathryn's reading, filled the room. I loved you boys more than I could express, but I didn't know how to show it. After she finished, there was silence. Then Philip spoke. I forgive him. I forgave him years ago. But hearing him admit he didn't know how, that makes it easier. Because I spent so long thinking he didn't want to show love, that he chose distance, but he didn't choose it. He just didn't know another way. That's the conclusion the family came to. Not that Bing was perfect, not that Gary was wrong, but that the situation was more complicated than blame and victimhood. Bing had failed his first 4 sons in important ways, but he'd succeeded in others. He'd provided for them, given them opportunities, tried, in his limited way, to prepare them for life. It wasn't enough. 3 of them couldn't survive the weight of being his sons, but it wasn't nothing either. Kathryn Crosby died on September 20th. She was 90 years old. She'd spent 47 years as Bing's widow, and in that time she dedicated herself to protecting his legacy, not by denying the truth, but by providing context, the full picture. Her obituary mentioned Gary's book. That book had defined the conversation about Bing for 40 years, but the obituary also mentioned Kathryn's response, the grace with which she'd handled it, the nuance she'd brought, the letter she'd finally shared. Kathryn had done something rare. She'd defended someone without demonizing their accuser. That's the legacy of the Crosby family saga. Not that one side was right and the other wrong, but that families are complicated. That truth is multifaceted. Bing Crosby was a great entertainer and a flawed father. Gary Crosby was a hurt son and an unreliable narrator. Both things can be true simultaneously. What betrayed Bing Crosby wasn't his son's book. What betrayed him was the simplicity people demanded, the need for heroes or villains. Bing was neither. He was human. He made mistakes, hurt people he loved, failed to communicate, and those failures had consequences, real devastating consequences. But he also tried, recognized his failures, wished he could fix them, and with his second chance, his second family, he did better, not perfectly, but better, and that growth matters. It doesn't erase the damage done to the first 4 sons, but it proves that damage wasn't inevitable, wasn't desired, was just the result of a man stumbling through fatherhood without a map. Gary Crosby's book will always be part of Bing Crosby's story. It can't be removed, can't be ignored, but it also can't be the only chapter, because the truth is bigger than one person's pain. The truth includes Philip's forgiveness, Lindsay and Dennis's tragedy, Harry, Mary Frances, and Nathaniel's love, Kathryn's loyalty, and in Bing's own words, I loved you boys more than I could express. That sentence captures the real tragedy. Not that Bing didn't love his sons, but that he couldn't show it in ways they understood, couldn't bridge the gap between feeling and expression, couldn't be both the man the world needed and the father his children deserved. He tried to be both, and in trying, he failed at one, and that failure echoed across generations. There's a photograph from 1946, Bing with his 4 sons from his first marriage. They're at the beach, young boys, maybe 6 to 12 years old. Bing is in the middle, arms around 2 of them. He's smiling. The boys are smiling. It looks perfect, like a magazine cover, like the American dream. But if you look closely at the boys' eyes, you can see something else, a wariness, a distance. They're smiling because they're supposed to smile, because the camera is there. But the ease, the relaxation, the genuine joy, it's not quite there. And that photograph, more than any book or interview or letter, tells the truth. The Crosby family looked perfect. But looking perfect and being perfect are very different things. Gary spent his life trying to show people that difference, trying to pull back the curtain, trying to say, look, this is what it really was. And he succeeded. The world saw. The world understood that Bing Crosby was complicated. But in succeeding, Gary also lost something. He lost the ability to see his father as anything other than the source of his pain. And that's a loss too. A different kind of tragedy. Philip, in his final interview before he died in 2004, was asked what he wished people understood about his family. He thought for a long time. Then he said, I wish people understood that everyone in our family was doing their best. Dad was doing his best. Mom was doing her best. We were doing our best. And all of our bests collided in ways that hurt people. That's not a story of good versus evil. That's just a story of being human. And maybe that's the final word. Not vindication, not condemnation, just recognition. The Crosbys were human. All of them. Bing, Dixie, Gary, Philip, Dennis, Lindsay, Kathryn, Harry, Mary Frances, Nathaniel, human beings navigating impossible situations with limited tools and doing damage along the way. Bing Crosby died believing he'd been a good father. Gary Crosby died believing he'd been abused. Both believed their truth, and both truths, contradictory as they seem, were real. That's the mystery of family. That's the tragedy of memory. That's the burden every child of fame carries, the gap between the public image and the private reality. And the impossibility of ever fully bridging that gap.